The first thing Sergeant Dara Okafor noticed about the alien ship was that it was green, not the cold, sterile green of military equipment or the artificial green of a hospital ward. It was the green of deep jungle at dusk, the green of moss on wet stone, the green of something alive in the way that old things are alive, slowly, patiently, without urgency. The ship hung above the ruins of Accra like a massive seed that had decided, after traveling incomprehensible distances across the void, that this broken, smoking city was a good enough place to put down roots. She watched it from the third floor of what used to be a bank. Her rifle was propped against the window frame. She had 14 rounds left. Sergeant. Private Yusuf Mensa was 17 years old and looked younger. He was crouched behind a collapsed desk, holding his helmet with both hands like a child clutching a favorite toy. Sergeant, it's not moving. I can see that. What does that mean? When they stop moving? She had no answer for him. She had stopped pretending to have answers somewhere around the fourth day, when Captain Adeyemi had been taken apart by one of the cultivators in full view of the entire third platoon. Not violently, not out of rage, but with the careful, methodical precision of a researcher dissecting a specimen that had exceeded its usefulness. It had been that deliberateness, more than the act itself, that had broken something in the surviving soldiers. You could fight rage. You could match rage with rage and sometimes come out the other side. But you couldn't fight something that regarded you the way a botanist regards a weed. It means they're done with this sector, she said finally. Move when I move. The cultivators. That was the name that had spread through the surviving human networks, passed in whispers across broken radio frequencies, and scratched into walls by people who needed to name the thing that was killing them. The cultivators had arrived 8 months ago. They had not announced themselves. There had been no radio broadcast, no dramatic descent from a clear blue sky, no single massive ship blotting out the sun in a way that gave humanity time to prepare. They had simply appeared in low orbit, hundreds of ships in that same deep organic green, and within 6 hours the agricultural infrastructure of the planet had begun to die. Not from bombs, not from energy weapons, though they had those, too, deployed with surgical precision when the human military had attempted coordinated resistance. The primary weapon of the cultivators was something the surviving scientists called enzymatic dissolution, a compound released from the ships that broke the molecular bonds of cultivated plant life. Farm crops, orchards, managed forests, anything that humanity had planted, shaped, or maintained. Wild ecosystems were unaffected. The compound seemed to recognize the signature of human agricultural intervention at a genetic level and disassemble it, returning the soil to a pre-agricultural state. In 8 months, they had erased 10,000 years of human farming. The math was simple and brutal. 8 billion people collapsing food production. A species that had, over millennia, made itself entirely dependent on systems that were now gone. The cultivators appeared to understand this math perfectly. They were patient. They were not trying to kill humanity directly. They were simply removing the conditions that allowed humanity to survive at scale, the way you might remove the water from a fish tank and then wait. Dara had been in the field for 6 of those 8 months. She had started with a company of 112 soldiers. She had 22 left, scattered across a 6-block radius of what had been downtown Accra, surviving on tinned food raided from restaurants and supermarkets, supplemented by whatever wild plants the local botanist in their group, a compact, precise woman named Doctor. Abina Asare, who had been trying to take a sabbatical in Cape Coast when the ships arrived, could identify as edible. Abina had become, without anyone formally deciding it, the most important person in their group. She was waiting at the bottom of the bank's stairwell when Dara came down, Mensa close behind. She had a cloth bag over one shoulder, her field notebook clutched against her chest, and she was studying something she had scraped off the wall. A thin line of green growth, barely visible, running up through a crack in the concrete. What is that? Mensa asked. Chlorella vulgaris, I think, or something very close to it. She tilted her head, examining it with the focused pleasure of someone encountering an old friend in an unexpected place. Single-celled green algae. It was here before we were, and it'll be here after. The compound didn't kill it? The compound doesn't kill wild organisms, only cultivated ones. She straightened. That's what I've been trying to explain to the Colonel. If they were trying to kill all plant life, they'd have released something different. They're specifically targeting agricultural genomic signatures, crops bred and selected by humans over generations. So they know the difference, Dara said. They know the difference down to the molecular level. This isn't a blunt instrument. Abena tucked the notebook under her arm. They've studied us. They know our agricultural history better than most humans do. They knew exactly what to hit. Dara processed this. She had been processing it for months. The precision of the attack wasn't just impressive, it was a message. You built this, it said. We understand what you built. We understand how it works, and we can unmake it. Status on the water point? She asked. Switching back to the immediate, clean so far. The filtration Corporal Diallo built is holding. Abena paused. Though I've been thinking about that too. Think while we move. They went out through the bank's side entrance, into what had been a side street and was now a narrow canyon of collapsed masonry and overgrown rubble. 6 months without human maintenance had allowed vegetation to begin reclaiming the city with a speed that still startled Dara. Not the cultivated greenery of parks and flower pots, which had dissolved like the farms, but wild growth, opportunistic and resilient, pushing up through cracked asphalt and threading through broken windows, ferns, wild grasses, shrubs with no names she knew. The city was being repossessed by the biosphere, one crack at a time. She sometimes seems caught herself looking at that wild growth the way she imagined. The cultivators must see it. With something like approval, which disturbed her enough that she tried not to think about it. They moved in a practiced formation, Dara on point, Mensa covering the rear, Abena in the middle where her lack of tactical training was least likely to get anyone killed. Corporal Diallo and Private Osi were waiting at the rendezvous point, a collapsed parking structure whose upper floors had caved in to create a natural roof over the lower level. 6 other survivors were there, eating, sleeping, maintaining equipment in the low light. Diallo met them at the entrance. He was 43, a former civil engineer who had been conscripted into the engineering corps when the military had started pulling in anyone who could build things. He had a way of presenting information that made everything sound like a routine maintenance update, which Dara had come to value enormously. Movement 2 blocks north, he said, one of them, walking the perimeter. Alone? They often come alone in the post-processing phase. He used the term matter-of-factly, the way a doctor uses clinical language to keep emotion at a manageable distance. Post-processing phase. What the cultivators called the period after a sector's agricultural infrastructure had been dissolved, when 1 or 2 cultivators would walk the area, apparently confirming the work was complete, taking samples, making notes in whatever passed for notes among beings who communicated in ways humans hadn't cracked. A single cultivator. She had killed 3 of them over 6 months. Each time had cost her something, not just ammunition, not just the tactical risk, but something harder to name, some part of her willingness to believe that the situation could get better. Because killing a cultivator didn't help. They had no apparent hierarchy to decapitate, no chain of command to disrupt. They just sent more. They sent the same slow, deliberate presence, the same maddening indifference. But she thought about what Abena had said. They've studied us. I want to capture it, she said. Diallo's expression didn't change, but his stillness deepened in a specific way she had learned to read. Surgent, not kill. Capture. Alive, if that word applies. Surgent, the last time we engaged a single. Last time we tried to kill it. I want to try something different. She looked at Abena. Abena was already thinking. She could see it. The slight furrow, the way her eyes focused on something internal. You want to study them the way they studied us, Abena said. I want to understand something they know that I don't. Abena nodded slowly. The compound. If I could get a sample directly from one of them, not from the environment, where it's already dispersed and degraded, I might be able to understand the delivery mechanism, the trigger, what it's actually reading when it identifies a cultivated plant signature. She paused. There might be something to find there. I don't know what yet. That's good enough for me. It took 2 hours to prepare. Diallo engineered the trap, a pit covered with rubble that would collapse under the weight of anything larger than a human, fitted with anchor points for the improvised restraints he built from salvaged cable and rebar. Dara positioned her 7 best remaining soldiers at carefully calculated angles, with strict orders. Do not engage unless the cultivator breaks the perimeter. Do not fire unless she gives the signal. And if she gives the signal, fire everything, all at once, with no hesitation. She watched the cultivator approach from a second-floor window. They were approximately 2 meters tall and moved with a fluid, unhurried grace that reminded her of something she could never quite name. Not the grace of a predator, which carried urgency, but the grace of something that had never needed to hurry, because nothing had ever threatened it. Their bodies were bilateral but not humanoid. 4 limbs arranged in 2 pairs, the upper pair longer and more dexterous, all of them ending in what looked, from a distance, like clusters of thin fingers that were always moving, processing the air the way a musician's fingers move when they're hearing music in their head. Their skin, if it was skin, was the same deep organic green as their ships, and it seemed to have a texture that changed as the light shifted, as if it was not quite solid, not quite settled. Their faces, if you could call them that, had no eyes in any location she could identify. Two dark vertical slits that might have been olfactory organs, a horizontal seam that opened and closed in patterns that the linguists had been studying for 8 months without producing any translation. They did not seem to breathe. This one was moving through the street below with the same methodical purpose she had observed before, pausing at irregular intervals, extending one of its upper limbs, taking something from the air that she couldn't see, confirming, noting, moving on. It reached the rubble pile at the designated point. It stopped. The pause lasted long enough that Dara felt the first cold edge of doubt. They were perceptive in ways that weren't fully understood. If it had detected the trap, it stepped forward. The rubble gave way. The cultivator dropped 3 feet, and the cable system triggered, looping around its lower limbs with a sharp mechanical snap that echoed off the surrounding buildings like a gunshot. What happened next was not what she expected. It did not struggle. It did not make any sound she could identify as alarm or distress. It simply stopped moving and turned the part of its body where a face would be toward the point in the building where it seemed to understand, with unsettling accuracy, that she was standing. It waited. She came down from the building. Her soldiers held their positions. Abina was at her side. Up close, the cultivator was a different thing entirely. The surface of its skin, and she decided it was skin because there were variations in it, subtle textures and patterns, moved. Not in the way that muscles move under skin, but in the way that weather moves across a landscape. Broad, slow, purposeful shifts in the underlying, something that created what she could only describe as expression. Though she had no framework for reading it, it was looking at her. She was certain of it, even without eyes she could identify. There was a quality of directed attention in the way it held itself that was unmistakable. She met it. In her left breast pocket against her chest, she kept a photograph. It was a small, unremarkable photograph, her mother's farm outside Kumasi, taken the summer before Dara had left for military training. Her mother standing in the field, holding up a yam the size of a small child, laughing. The farm had been 100 hectares of carefully tended land that her family had worked for 4 generations. The compound had taken it in the first week. She did not take out the photograph, but she was aware of it the way you are always aware of the thing you carry closest. Abena, she said quietly, do what you need to do. Abina moved forward with her sample kit, a repurposed first aid case now holding improvised collection tools made from salvaged lab equipment. She was calm in a way that Dara had learned to recognize as the particular calm of someone who had decided that scientific curiosity was stronger than fear and was choosing to act on that decision moment by moment. The cultivator watched her work. It did not resist. It did not assist. It watched with what Dara could only interpret as interest. The compound is concentrated in the surface tissue, Abena said, her voice low and steady, talking to herself as much as anyone. The entire outer layer is a delivery system. It's not just releasing compound into the environment, it's carrying it, continuously processing the local air, the soil chemistry, feeding it data about what it encounters. She paused, using a thin probe to take a scraping that she sealed into a sample container. That's remarkable. It's not a weapon. It's an assessment tool that happens to have a lethal secondary effect. Assessment. It's reading the world. All the time. Everything it touches. She took another sample, and it's comparing what it reads to a database. The agricultural genetic signatures, that's what triggers the compound release. But the reading itself, she trailed off. What? I need to look at this more carefully. She sealed the last sample and stepped back. But I think, and this is preliminary, Sergeant, I think it can read the difference between cultivation and what I'd call directed cultivation, between a field that a human planted for food and a forest that a human planted because they were trying to restore an ecosystem. The silence stretched. Say that again, Dara said. The compound responds to agricultural intent, food production, resource extraction, monoculture signatures. Everything we've lost has that in common. We planted it, we managed it, we harvested it. Abena's voice carried the tight, suppressed excitement of a scientist who has just seen something important. But I've been watching the wild growth in the city, and I've been watching what the compound doesn't affect. And I think there's a category of human plant cultivation that it doesn't recognize as agricultural. Restoration planting, Dara said slowly. Rewilding, habitat gardens, native species planting. Food forests designed to mimic natural ecosystems. Abena looked at the cultivator, then back at Dara. The compound can't distinguish between a human-assisted native forest and a forest that grew without human involvement because the genomic signature of the plants is identical. They're the same plants. The only thing different is what the human did. Dara stood very still for a long moment. She thought about 10,000 years of human agriculture. She thought about the slow, centuries-long process by which humanity had taken wild plants and reshaped them, selecting for yield, for size, for resistance, for flavor, until they bore almost no resemblance to their wild ancestors. She thought about wheat that could not survive without human cultivation, about corn that could not propagate without human hands, about 1,000 crops that were, in a very real sense, entirely human inventions. She thought about what the cultivators had actually done. They had not tried to erase all of human civilization. They had not attacked human language, or art, or medicine, or engineering. They had attacked the specific thing that 10,000 years of history had made the foundation of everything. Else, the ability to feed 8 billion people through intensive, industrial, monoculture agriculture. They had attacked a specific kind of human relationship with the natural world, a kind that had, she now understood, also produced enormous damage to the ecosystems it had replaced. She thought about her mother's farm. She thought about the photograph in her pocket. They're not trying to destroy us, she said. Abena met her eyes. No. They're trying to what? Correct us? Change what we are? I don't know what they're trying to do. Abena glanced at the cultivator. But I know what the compound does, and I know what it doesn't do, and I think that distinction is important. Dara looked at the cultivator for a long time. It had not moved. It was still watching her with that quality of directed attention that she couldn't name. She thought about what it would take to communicate something across a gap that wide. Not just different languages, but different biologies, different histories, different understandings of what the world was for. She thought about her mother, who had spoken 7 languages, none of them formally learned, all of them acquired, because the farm sat at the intersection of 3 different linguistic regions, and her mother had decided that understanding her neighbors was more useful than expecting them to understand her. Let it go, she said. Diallo looked at her sharply. Sergeant, let it go. He hesitated for only a moment, then signaled to the others. The cable system was released. The cultivator rose smoothly from the pit, the effortlessness of the movement underscoring, without drama, exactly how much it had been choosing to remain still. It stood on the rubble for a moment, looking at her. Then it extended one of its upper limbs, slowly, with a deliberateness that did not feel threatening, and touched the concrete wall beside the opening. Where its fingers made contact, a thin line of green appeared. Not the manufactured green of the compound, but a deep, vital, living green, the green of growth, spreading outward from the touchpoint like ink in water. Then it walked away. No one spoke for a long time. What was that? Mensa asked finally. Abena was already crouching beside the wall, examining the line of green. Seeds, she said softly, or spores. Something viable. Something wild. She looked up, and her expression had the quality of someone who has just understood something they've been trying to understand for a very long time. It left us something that will grow. Dara's report reached Colonel Mensa, no relation to her private Mensa, a fact that had been the source of exactly one joke in the 6 months since she'd been under his command, and the joke had not landed well, by the fragmented radio network that the surviving military was using to maintain some approximation of coordinated command. The colonel was in Lagos, or what remained of it, with approximately 300 soldiers and twice that many civilians. His response came 12 hours later and was characteristically direct. I need you here. She made the journey with 7 soldiers, a bina, and everything they could carry. The route took 4 days, moving through a landscape that was becoming, month by month, less recognizable as the country she had grown up in. The cities were the worst of it, not because of destruction, though there was plenty of that, but because of the absence. No food markets, no smell of cooking, the specific sensory register of a West African city at noon, the layers of smell and sound that were, she understood now, almost entirely produced by human food culture, was simply gone. What remained was quieter and stranger and, in some ways, more beautiful, as the wild growth pushed through the gaps with the patient indifference of something that had been waiting a very long time for the opportunity. She caught herself finding it beautiful, and was troubled by this, and then decided to stop being troubled by it, because there were more important things to be troubled by. Dr. Kofi Ando met them at the Lagos Perimeter Checkpoint. He was the lead scientist in what the colonel had grandly labeled the Xenobiological Analysis Unit, which in practice meant 3 biologists with salvaged equipment operating out of a repurposed school gymnasium. He had heard about Abena's samples before Dara had even arrived, information moving faster than people through the network, and he met them with The specific barely contained energy of a scientist who has been sitting with an incomplete dataset and has just been told that the missing piece is on its way. The delivery mechanism, he said, the moment they had cleared the checkpoint. Not hello, not how was the journey. Tell me about the delivery mechanism. The compound is carried in the surface tissue, Abena said. The entire outer layer functions as a continuous sampling array. It reads the chemistry of whatever it contacts and compares it to a reference database. The database. That's what I need to understand. He was walking fast, leading them through streets that had the organized chaos of a military installation overlaid on a civilian infrastructure that had not been designed for any of this. We have the compound itself. We've had samples for months, but we couldn't understand how it discriminated. It kept triggering on cultivated species and not triggering on wild species, but there was no obvious chemical difference in most cases. The trigger isn't chemical. It's genomic, Abina said. Agricultural selection signatures, generations of directed breeding. Ando stopped walking. He turned to look at her with an expression that combined professional admiration with something almost like anger at the simplicity of it. Of course, he said. Of course that's it. He resumed walking, faster. We've been looking at the plants. We should have been looking at the history of the plants. There's more. Abina glanced at Dara. There's a category of cultivation that the compound doesn't recognize. She outlined it. Ando listened without interrupting, which was, Dara gathered, unusual. When Abena finished, he was quiet for a long time. Restored ecosystems, he said finally. Native species planting. Human cultivation that produces a wild genomic signature. He looked at Dara. You understand what this means? I think so. It means we can grow food. He said it simply, the way you say something that has been true for a long time but that you've just understood. Not the way we grew food before, but we can grow food. The colonel was waiting in the school gymnasium. He was a tall man who had gone gray in the 8 months since the ships arrived, and who had a way of listening that made you feel that your words were being measured against something heavy. He heard Dara's report, standing, arms folded, looking at the floor. When she finished, he was quiet for almost 2 minutes. They left us a gift, he said. Seeds, or spores, something viable, after we captured one of them, after I ordered it released. He looked at her then. You're telling me that this was communication. I'm telling you it might have been. I'm telling you I don't know what it was. But I know what it felt like. What did it feel like? She thought about it carefully, because the colonel was the kind of man who respected careful thinking, and she didn't want to waste this. It felt like being corrected by someone who was certain they were right and was trying, with some frustration, to make you understand why, without being willing to simply tell you the answer. A long silence. Like a teacher, Menza said from across the room. Everyone looked at him. He was, Dara noted, as surprised as anyone by his own contribution. They're teaching us, he said, less certainly, or they think they are. They came to end industrial agriculture, Dara said, and they came prepared for us to fight back. They knew we would. They're not surprised by the military resistance, but they think, or they thought, that if they removed the old system, we'd have to find a different way. She paused. They calculated that we'd survive the transition. They calculated that we'd adapt. That's a significant amount of confidence in a species you're trying to change, the colonel said. They've studied us. Abina said they know our agricultural history better than most humans do. They know about the damage the old system caused, the soil degradation, the monoculture collapse, the ecological damage. She looked at Abena. Tell him what you told me. Abena stepped forward. The compound doesn't just read agricultural genomic signatures. It's also reading soil chemistry, ecosystem diversity, carbon sequestration rates. It's building a picture of the ecological health of every area it contacts. The areas with the highest compound activity weren't necessarily the most densely populated. They were the areas with the most intensive monoculture, agriculture, the most depleted soils, the most damaged ecosystems. She paused. They went after the most broken parts first. The colonel absorbed this. You're suggesting that this is calibrated. I'm suggesting that it was designed by something that understood, in detail, how human agriculture had damaged the planet and targeted the response accordingly. She hesitated. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. It makes it different, the colonel said. He turned away, looking out the gymnasium's high windows at the sky where 3 of the green ships were currently visible, hanging silent in the afternoon light, patient as mountains. They expected us to adapt, he said. They're waiting for us to adapt. He looked back. How long before we can produce food using the methods Dr. Asara described? How long before we can feed people? Ando spoke before Abena could. First harvests, if we start immediately, with everything we have, 3 months minimum. For native food forests, perennial systems, things that grow the way the wild grows. He paused. It's slower. The yields per acre are a fraction of what we were getting from monoculture. But how large a fraction? In terms of calories per acre, maybe a fifth, maybe a tenth. A murmur through the room. Mathematics. Running in every head present, 8 billion people, a fifth of the calories. The gap between those two numbers was the gap between now and any imaginable future. But, Andau continued, because he was not finished, the long-term picture is different. A native food forest, once established, doesn't require inputs. It doesn't require irrigation infrastructure or chemical fertilizers or the entire industrial supply chain we lost. It requires human knowledge and human labor and nothing else. And its yields improve over time, not decline. We've been farming by mining the soil. This would be farming by building it. The colonel looked at Dara. She looked back. The transition period, he said. Between now and the first harvests. That's the gap. We can make it, she said. You sound certain. I've seen what people are doing out there. She thought of the green line on the concrete wall. She thought of the wild growth pushing through cracked asphalt. She thought of Abena identifying edible plants by name in a language older than any of this. Humans have been surviving without industrial agriculture for most of our history. We still remember how. Not well, and not easily, and not without losing people we can't afford to lose. But we remember. We didn't choose this change. No, she met his eyes steadily. But we can choose what we do with it. Another long silence. The colonel unfolded his arms, slowly, the gesture of someone setting down something they've been carrying. Find me every botanist, every ecologist, every agricultural scientist, every traditional farmer with knowledge of native species. Find me every seed bank that's still accessible. Find me every stretch of ground within a day's travel that has the soil chemistry to support a food forest. He looked at Diallo. Engineer me water systems that don't require industrial inputs, natural filtration, gravity-fed distribution, everything we can build from what's on the ground. He looked at Abena last, and find me a way to communicate with them. I don't care how impossible that seems. I care about the fact that one of them left us seeds, and I'd like to know if there are more where those came from. The communication attempt took 11 weeks. It started with Abena's samples and Ando's analysis and the combined effort of everyone in the Lagos compound with any relevant knowledge, linguists, biologists, ecologists, a retired zoologist named Professor Mensah, who had spent 30 years studying chemical communication in social insects and turned out to be, against all probability, one of the most useful people they had. Chemical language, he said, the first time he sat down with the full team. Not metaphorically, they communicate chemically. The surface tissue, that continuous sampling array Dr. Asare identified, it's also a transmitter. They're constantly broadcasting as well as receiving. We've been reading it as background noise. It isn't. The breakthrough, when it came, was less dramatic than anyone had hoped for and more meaningful than anyone had expected. A chemical signal, painstakingly assembled from components they had identified in the samples, broadcast from a canister Diallo had built out of salvaged lab equipment and agricultural sprayers. The signal was a question, as far as Ando and Professor Mensah could construct one. The translation was approximate. The closest English rendering was, "What do you want us to become?" They broadcast it from a rooftop in the middle of the city, aimed at the nearest ship. The ship did not respond for 6 days. On the 7th day, one of the ships descended, not to the rooftop, to the edge of the city, where a small team of volunteers had spent 3 months planting the beginning of a food forest. Native trees, edible ground cover, nitrogen-fixing shrubs, a carefully designed ecosystem that would, if everything went right, be producing food in 2 years and flourishing in 10. It was 3 hectares. It was, in the context of feeding 8 billion people, essentially nothing. It was also, Abena had been telling anyone who would listen, a beginning. The ship came down over the food forest and hovered. Dara was there. She had insisted on being there. The colonel had not argued. 3 cultivators descended. They moved through the food forest with the same methodical attention she had observed before, pausing, extending their limbs, reading the chemistry of the air and the soil and the plants with that fluid, unhurried precision. But there was something different in how they moved through this space, compared to how they moved through the ruins of monoculture fields. The pauses were longer, the attention more, she searched for the word, more interested. After 20 minutes, one of them approached her. She stood her ground. Behind her, she was aware of Abena, who had specifically not been given a weapon, and who was, therefore, the most genuinely courageous person in the vicinity. The cultivator extended its upper limb. In the cluster of fingers at the end, it held something. A small, dense object, dark and irregular, the size of her fist. She held out her hand. It placed the object on her palm. It was a root, or something like a root, something that had grown in darkness and stored what it needed and waited for the right conditions. She could feel, through her palm, a faint warmth. It's viable, Abena said softly from behind her, close enough to see. It's alive. The cultivator was still looking at her. That quality of directed attention. The moving surface of its skin, shifting in patterns she still could not read. She reached into her left breast pocket and took out the photograph. Her mother's farm. Her mother standing in the field, holding up a yam the size of a small child, laughing. 4 generations of work in that photograph. 4 generations of a relationship between people and land that had known how to do this before the industrial age came and taught everyone to forget. She held out the photograph. She didn't know if it could see in a way that photographs meant anything. She didn't know if the concept of a photograph, a flat image representing a specific moment in specific lives, translated across whatever gulf, separated their biologies. She didn't know if what she was trying to say could be said this way. The cultivator took the photograph, held it. The fingers moved across its surface with the same careful attention it brought to everything. Then it gave the photograph back, and it did something she had never seen one of them do. It crouched. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly and deliberately, folding its long body down until it was at her eye level, the part of it where a face would be level with her face. The deliberateness of it was its own language. It was choosing to meet her where she was. It was choosing to make itself smaller. She held the photograph between them. This is what we had, she said, knowing that the words meant nothing and saying them anyway, because some things need to be said out loud even when no one can hear them. This is what we built. This is what 4 generations of my family put their hands and their days and their whole lives into. She took a breath. And I think I understand what it cost, what it costs, what it was taking from the world. I'm not going to tell you it was right, because I don't know if it was right. I don't know the whole picture the way you know it. The cultivator had not moved. She pressed on. But it was ours. And my mother loved it. And I need you to know that. I need you to know that the thing you destroyed was loved. The cultivator reached forward again, slowly, giving her time to see it coming, and touched the photograph. Not the image, but the edge. The worn corner where she had folded and unfolded it so many times that the paper had softened. The warmth she had felt from the root. She felt it again from its touch. She did not know what that meant. She might never know. But she felt it. Then it rose and turned and walked back toward the food forest. All 3 cultivators moved through it one more time, and then they ascended. And the ship rose, and Dara stood in the young forest with a root in one hand and a photograph in the other, and the smell of real earth around her, which she had almost forgotten was a smell that existed. Abena put a hand on her shoulder. What was that root? Dara asked. Her voice was steadier than she expected. I don't know yet. Abena took it gently, but I'm going to find out. The root was a wild yam, not a cultivated variety. A wild ancestor from the same family as the domesticated yam that had fed West Africa for centuries. Older, harder, lower yielding, demanding in ways that its agricultural descendants had been bred to eliminate. But viable, growing. And when Ando's team analyzed its genome, they found something that stopped everyone cold. It had been modified, not obviously. Not in the way that GMO crops were modified, with blunt insertions and clear signatures. Subtly, at the level of a single nucleotide sequence in one regulatory gene, in a way that would have been invisible to any standard analysis. The modification increased the yam's nitrogen-fixing capability by a factor that would, over time, enrich the soil it grew in rather than depleting it. The wild yam was teaching the soil how to grow the wild yam. They gave us something better, Ando said. He was looking at the data on a salvaged laptop screen in the dim gymnasium. His voice was quiet. They took what we had and replaced it with something better. Better for the long term. Better for the ecosystem. Better for, he stopped. Better for us, Abena finished. Eventually. It still requires the transition. It still requires the period where we don't have enough food. It's still, he stopped again. They didn't eliminate the hard part. No, Dara said. She was sitting on the edge of a table, looking at nothing in particular. They didn't eliminate the hard part. They could have, Ando said. He wasn't accusing anyone. He was thinking out loud the way scientists do when they're trying to understand something. If they can modify wild yam genome that precisely, they could feed us directly. They could give us everything we lost in a form that doesn't damage the planet. They could make the transition painless. But they didn't. Dara thought about a teacher who makes you work out the proof yourself, instead of just showing you the answer. She thought about the cultivator crouching to meet her eye level. She thought about a gift that came with difficulty built in. They think the hard part is the lesson, she said. No one argued. The colonel's mobilization had been going on for 8 weeks before the food. Forrest was visited. In that time, several things had happened that would have seemed impossible in the first months after the ships arrived. 3 traditional farming communities in the river delta regions, communities that had never fully abandoned pre-industrial agricultural practices because they had never fully trusted industrial systems they hadn't chosen, turned out to be growing food. Not in the volumes of modern agriculture, but consistently, sustainably, using techniques that were, when the scientists looked at them carefully, essentially native ecosystem management with food production as a secondary benefit. The compound had passed over their fields without effect. Word spread through the surviving networks. People started walking toward those communities. Not soldiers, not officials, just people carrying what they could carry, moving toward the places where the food was. It was, Dara thought, the most human possible response to an alien attack. Stop fighting what you can't fight and start walking toward what you can eat. The botanists and ecologists became the most sought-after people in West Africa. Not the generals, not the politicians, not the engineers. The people who knew the names of wild plants and understood how ecosystems worked and could look at a piece of ground and tell you what it wanted to grow. Diallo's water systems multiplied. They were not efficient by modern standards. They required constant maintenance and human knowledge and an understanding of local topography that took time to acquire. They were also, he pointed out repeatedly, completely unkillable by any compound that targeted agriculture because they contained no agriculture. They were gravity and physics and human understanding of how water moved. You could not dissolve physics, and the seeds spread from the root the cultivator had given her, from the seeds it had left on the wall in Accra, from the material in the samples Abena had collected. All of it analyzed, propagated, planted with the careful attention of people who understood that they were building something that would take longer than any of them to complete, but that had to start now with these hands, in this ground. Dara spent a week with her hands in the soil. She had not expected to be good at it. She had spent her adult life doing things that were the opposite of patient. Military life, which moved in lurches of extreme intensity, separated by periods of enforced stillness, was not good preparation for the slow rhythm of ecological cultivation. But there was something in the physical act of planting, kneeling in dirt, pressing a seed into soil that had been carefully prepared, covering it with the particular care that was something between hope and prayer, that she found she had been missing for a long time without knowing she was missing it. She was covered in dirt and working on a section of the food forest perimeter when she looked up and found Private Mensa working 2 rows over. He had been assigned to the forest work detail 3 days ago. The colonel was rotating everyone through it, partly for the labor and partly, Dara suspected, because he believed in the psychological value of doing something that grew. Mensa was working with a concentration she didn't often see in him, pressing seeds into the soil with a focused deliberateness that reminded her, she realized with a small surprise, of the way he had held his helmet in the bank building months ago. The same careful grip, as if the thing in his hands mattered. Mensa, she said. He looked up. What are you planting? He looked at the seed in his hand. Wild cassava. The doctor said it's an ancestor variety. Lower yield, but it fixes nitrogen in the soil. He paused. My grandmother grew cassava. Regular kind. I used to watch her. What do you remember about it? He thought. She's used to sing when she was planting. She said the plants grew better if you sang to them. He shrugged, a little embarrassed. I know that's not. What did she sing? A pause. Then, quietly he began to hum. A simple melody, unhurried, the kind of song that sounded like it had been old when anyone living had first learned it. She listened. Around them, the food forest was barely a suggestion. Low plants, young trees, a patchwork of different green things that would take years to become what it needed to be. But it was alive. That was the thing. Under the sky where alien ships still hung patient and immovable, in the dirt of a city that had been rearranged by forces no one had asked for, in the sound of a young soldier humming his grandmother's song, things were alive. She pressed her seed into the soil and covered it. The second communication was clearer. It came 6 weeks after the food forest visit, and it came from the ships, a chemical broadcast, vast and sustained, spread across the atmosphere in concentrations that the monitors Ando had built could detect from miles away. Professor Mensah spent 3 days analyzing it. It's an acknowledgement, he said finally. His voice was carefully neutral in the way of someone managing strong feeling, and an offer. Offer of what? Knowledge. Their ecological database, the one the compound reads from, the one that knows what wild looks like. They're offering to share access to it. He paused. Not all of it. Not the deep technical content. Either they can't transmit that in a form we can use yet, or they've chosen not to. But the catalog, the taxonomy, the full picture of what Earth's ecosystems looked like for 10,000 years of agriculture. He looked at Dara. Before us, the room was very quiet. We had fragments of that, Ando said. Archaeological pollen records, indigenous ecological knowledge, paleoclimate data, but fragments. He leaned forward. They have the whole picture. They've been watching Earth for a long time. How long? The colonel asked. The signal contains a time reference. We're still working on the calibration, but the initial estimate is. He stopped. The initial estimate is that they've been observing Earth for approximately 12,000 years. 2,000 years before the first cities. Since before the beginning of everything humanity had built and destroyed and built again. They watched us invent agriculture, Dara said, and everything that came after it. Professor Mensa looked out the window. They watched the whole story, from beginning to here. They must have intervened a long time ago, Mensa said. Everyone looked at the private. He had a habit, she had noticed, of saying things at exactly the moment when they needed to be said. If they've been watching for 12,000 years, he continued, and they only acted now, there was a reason they waited. Something changed. Something pushed them to act now, instead of at any other point in the last 12 millennia. The silences that followed had a different quality from the silences before it. The rate of change, Ando said slowly. The acceleration. The last 200 years compared to the previous 12,000. He was connecting something. She could see it. The damage in the last century compared to all of recorded history before it. They were watching a process that had been slow enough to be recoverable, and then it wasn't. The tipping point, Abina said. We hit a threshold. And he stopped. They intervened before we crossed something we couldn't come back from. Dara thought about this for a long time. She thought about what it felt like to be the person who watched something go wrong for a very long time, hoping it would correct itself, and then finally, at the last possible moment, chose to act. She thought about what that choice would cost, what it would look like from outside, an act of enormous violence, an intervention that would, from any ground-level view, appear entirely indistinguishable from an attack. She thought about what it felt like to care about something so much that you were willing to be hated for it. They love this planet, she said. The colonel looked at her. I know that sounds. She searched for the right word. I know it sounds like the wrong frame. But that's what 12,000 years of observation looks like from where I'm standing. They've been watching us and watching this planet, and she stopped because she was trying to say something true, and she wasn't sure she had the language for it. They came when they couldn't wait anymore, and everything they've done since, the compound, the seeds, the communication, it's all consistent with something that's trying to help, even if help looks like destruction from inside it. You're defending them, the colonel said. It was not an accusation. It was an honest observation. I'm trying to understand them, she said, which is not the same thing. She met his eyes. But understanding them is the only way we get through this. Hating them is easy. I've been hating them for 8 months. It didn't produce anything. He held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded. Once, respond to the signal, he said to Professor Mensa. Accept the offer. The ecological database began arriving in fragments over the following weeks, transmitted in the chemical language that Ando's team was learning with increasing fluency. It was like nothing any of them had seen. 12,000 years of observation, structured with a rigor that made every human ecological database look like rough notes. It showed them what Earth had been, biome by biome, watershed by watershed, soil horizon by soil horizon. The forests that had existed before the first clearings, the wetlands before the first drainage, the wild grasslands before the first plowing, and not as a static record, as a dynamic picture of a living system, showing relationships and dependencies and feedback loops in a complexity that would take years, decades to fully parse, but also showed them something else, embedded in the data, in the same chemical language that was encoding the ecological catalog, was a different kind of information, practical, specific, not what Earth had been, but what it could become. Transition protocols, Ando said, standing in front of a wall covered in transcribed data. They're not just showing us the destination, they're showing us the path. Calibrated to our current capacity? Abena asked. Calibrated to our current capacity, our current technology, at the level we can rebuild without industrial infrastructure, and our current knowledge base. He shook his head slowly. They know what we know. They know what we don't know. They built this specifically for us. For a humanity that just lost industrial agriculture and has to rebuild from the ground up, Dara said. For exactly that humanity. He looked at her. Sergeant, this is everything. If we can implement even a fraction of this, the transition period I estimated at 3 months becomes 6 weeks. The yields in a functioning food forest based on these protocols are 3 times what I projected. The soil building timeline is cut by 80%. He paused, and the professional neutrality dropped for just a moment, showing something underneath it that was close to wonder. They've been thinking about this, how to hand it back to us, how to give us the tools to build something better. They've been thinking about it for a long time. Dara stood in the middle of all that data and thought about a root placed in her hand, about seeds on a concrete wall, about the warmth of contact from something that had crossed light years to correct a mistake that was also a love. She thought about her mother's farm, about the yam in the photograph, about the specific pride in her mother's face. Not pride in herself, but pride in the relationship, in the understanding between people and soil that was the real product of 4 generations of work. She thought about what it would look like to rebuild that relationship. Not identically, not the monoculture, not the chemical inputs, not the dependency on systems that had broken the world even as they fed it, but the relationship, the knowledge of land, the understanding of what a piece of ground wanted to grow and how to help it grow that way while also growing what people needed to eat. The negotiation between human need and ecological reality that humanity had for a few hundred years stopped having to negotiate and had therefore forgotten how to do. They were going to have to learn. It would take generations. It would require a different kind of human knowledge than the industrial age had valued. Patient, specific, place-based, ecological knowledge, the kind that lived in communities and in practice, and in the memory of how the land had been before, the kind that some communities had never stopped holding, and that those communities were now, quietly and without fanfare, proving could sustain life. It would be hard. It would be the hardest thing humanity had attempted. Since what? Since the beginning. Since the first human hand pressed a seed into the ground and waited to see what grew. Maybe the hardest thing since the beginning, and the most similar to the beginning. She walked out of the data room and into the afternoon light of the food forest, which had been growing for 3 months now, and was beginning to look, in patches, like something that might eventually be called a forest. The trees were still young. The canopy was still sparse, but the ground between them was alive with low plants, with the particular organized wildness of a designed ecosystem finding its own rhythm. Mensa was there. Of course he was. He was kneeling in the dirt, doing something to a low shrub, with the careful attention she had watched him develop over the last weeks. He had turned out to be very good at this, not because he had any prior training. He hadn't, but because he was patient in a way that she thought might be inborn, a patience that the military had channeled into weapons maintenance and field preparation, and was now channeling into something that would outlast any of those things. Sergeant, he said without looking up, Mensa, the cassava is growing. He sat back on his heels and pointed to a section of the forest floor where she could see, if she looked closely, the first small leaves pushing through the soil, exact where he had planted them, weeks ago, singing his grandmother's song. Doctor, Asari says the nitrogen levels in this section are already higher than anywhere else in the forest. She crouched beside him and looked at the small leaves. They were tender and new and entirely certain about what they were doing. We're going to make it, she said, not a question. He considered it. This was something she had observed in him over the months. He didn't affirm things he wasn't certain about, and he didn't deny things that scared him, and both of these qualities had become more visible as the months passed, as if the pressure of everything that had happened had refined rather than distorted him. Not all of us, he said, not without a lot of loss, not without a lot of people dying in the transition who shouldn't have to die. A pause. But the species, yeah, we'll make it. Why are you certain? He looked at the cassava leaves. Because we're stubborn, he said, and because we remember. He tapped the soil beside one of the small plants. My grandmother remembered. That's why I remember. And she remembered because her grandmother taught her, and that grandmother remembered because her grandmother taught her. He trailed off. The industrial age tried to make us forget, and it almost worked, but it didn't fully work. The memory's still in us. Dara sat down cross-legged in the soil beside him, which was not a dignified posture for a sergeant and which she was past caring about. Tell me about her farm, she said. Your grandmother's. He looked at her, surprised. Then something in him relaxed, and he began to talk quietly and with a specificity that told her he had been carrying these memories carefully for a long time, the way you carry something fragile across a long distance. Above them, one of the green ships caught the light of the afternoon sun and held it for a moment before the angle shifted, And it became, again, that deep organic color that she had once found threatening and now found herself unable to separate from the color of growth. She listened. The small leaves of the wild cassava trembled in a wind that had come a long way across the open. Water to arrive here, in this particular piece of ground, at this particular moment, which was the beginning of something that did not have a name yet. It would grow into a name. Everything did, given time and the right conditions. She could wait. 3 months later, the ships began to move. Not away, not in a retreat that would have been, she suspected, a kind of abandonment. They redistributed, moving from the areas where the transition was underway to the areas where it had not yet begun, where the old agricultural systems were still being defended and the ecological damage was still accelerating. They did not attack. They brought the compound. They continued what they had come to do, with the same patience they had always brought to it. But in the areas where the transition was happening, where food forests were growing and soil was being rebuilt, and communities were learning the knowledge they had almost lost, the ships remained, present, not threatening, present in the way that very old things are present when you're doing something correctly. Dara received a formal commendation from the colonel that she put in the same pocket as the photograph. She received from Abena a cutting from the food forest's first productive tree, a species native to the West African woodland that she had not recognized at first, and that turned out to be, after Abena looked it up in the database the cultivators had shared, an ancestor species of the very variety that had grown on her mother's farm. Different, older, the original, before 4,000 years of selective cultivation had shaped it into the crop her family had grown. She planted it in a corner of the food forest that received the right light at the right angle of day, and she sat with it for a while, and she did not sing because she did not know the song, but she hummed, something close to a song, something that might become a song if she kept trying. Above her, the ship moved through the afternoon sky, slow and purposeful and entirely at home in the light of a star it had traveled incomprehensible distances to reach. She watched it until it was gone. Then she went back to work. The first food harvest was smaller than anyone had hoped for and larger than anyone had dared believe possible. It came in the 5th month after the food forest was planted, not a harvest in the old sense, not the systematic stripping of a monoculture field, but a gradual accumulation of different things from different parts of the forest, each one ready in its own time, on its own terms. Cassava leaves, wild yam tubers, the small tart fruits of a native tree that Professor Mensah identified as a species that had been considered ecologically extinct in urban West Africa for 40 years. Legumes that fixed nitrogen as they grew, enriching the soil for everything planted near them. Medicinal plants that Abina cataloged alongside the food plants, because she had learned from the cultivator database that the distinction between food and medicine was not one that healthy ecosystems recognized. The community that had gathered around the Lagos compound by then numbered close to 4,000. They had come from the city and from the surrounding countryside, drawn by the same rumor that had drawn people to the traditional farming. Communities in the Delta, there is food here. There are people who know how to grow it. Not all of them knew how to farm. Most of them had grown up in a world where food appeared in markets and restaurants and kitchens with the specific invisibility of things that technology had made reliable. They had never needed to know where food came from, in the deep specific sense of knowing the soil and the seeds and the seasonal rhythms and the knowledge that connected them. Most of them were learning for the first time. Dara taught 3 groups a week, not military tactics, not survival skills in the narrow sense. The knowledge that was in the cultivator database, translated by Ando's team into a form that people without specialist training could use. Soil preparation, seed selection, companion planting, water management, the reading of plant health, the recognition of what a piece of ground was telling you about what it needed. She was not a good teacher at first. She was too direct, too impatient, with the pace at which knowledge that had taken her months to acquire failed to immediately transfer to people who had just arrived and were cold and hungry and frightened. She had a tendency to give instructions instead of explanations, which worked in military contexts and failed badly in this one. Mensah, who had started teaching his own group, the youngest survivors, most of them teenagers who had been separated from their families during the early chaos, watched her struggle for 2 weeks before he said anything. "You're treating it like training," he said. They were walking the perimeter of the food forest at dawn, their daily habit of the last 2 months. Like there's a correct technique, and they need to learn it, or they'll fail. There is a correct technique. There's a technique that works in this soil, in this climate, with these specific plants, in this phase of this ecosystem's development. He paused. But the reason my grandmother's farm worked wasn't because she knew the correct technique. It was because she knew the farm. She knew it personally. She knew where the water pooled after heavy rain, and which corner of the field dried out fastest, and which trees the birds favored, and what that told her about the insect populations. He looked at her. You can't teach that. You can only teach people to pay attention until they learn it themselves. She thought about this for a long time. Then she changed how she taught. She stopped teaching technique. She started teaching attention. She would take a group into the forest and stand with them in one place and ask them to be still and tell her what they noticed. The quality of light through the canopy, the smell of the soil, the movement of insects between the plants, the places where the growth was vigorous, and the places where it was struggling, and the things in the immediate environment that might explain both. The learning that happened then was different, slower and less systematic, and more permanent. People stopped trying to remember rules and started trying to understand relationships. She began to think that this was what the cultivators had been trying to accomplish from the beginning. Not just the practical change, the shift from industrial monoculture to ecological food systems, but the internal change. The change in how humans related to the world they lived in. The shift from extracting to participating. She was thinking about this early one morning at the edge of the food forest when Abena found her. Abena had a look that Dara had learned to recognize, the specific expression of a scientist who has been sitting with a question for a very long time and has just arrived at an answer that is better and stranger than the question. I want to show you something, Abena said. She led Dara to the section of the food forest where the modified wild yam had been planted from the root the cultivator had given her. It had been growing for 5 months. It was, by any observable measure, thriving, larger than the unmodified wild yam varieties planted nearby. Its leaves a deeper green, its growth more vigorous, without being aggressive. But that wasn't what Abena wanted to show her. Look at the soil, Abena said. Dara crouched and looked. The soil around the modified yam was visibly different, darker, richer in texture, with the crumbly structure that Ando had explained was the signature of high microbial activity. The nitrogen-fixing modification was working exactly as his analysis had predicted. But there was something else, a fine network of pale threads, barely visible, running from the yam's root zone outward through the soil to the root systems of the plants around it. Mycorrhizal network, Abena said. It's connected to everything in a 15-meter radius. It's sharing resources, carbon, water, nitrogen, with every plant it's connected to. She was crouching beside Dara now, her voice carrying that quality of someone who is trying to contain a large feeling in a small space. That's not the modification. The modification was just the nitrogen-fixing enhancement. This network formation, this is the yam responding to the modification, cooperating with the ecosystem, because the modification made it more equipped to cooperate. Dara looked at the network of pale threads and thought about what they represented. A plant sharing what it had with the plants around it, below the surface where no one could see it, not because it was designed to, but because the conditions were right for it and it knew how. They didn't just give us a better yam, she said. They gave us a yam that teaches the ecosystem to function. Abena sat back. Everything in this section of the forest is doing better than the equivalent section 50 meters away, where we planted standard wild varieties. The soil quality, the growth rates, the diversity of organisms in the soil, everything. She looked at Dara. One modified plant, one change, and the whole system around it shifted. Dara was quiet for a while, looking at the network of threads in the dark soil. They've done this before, she said. It wasn't a question. The database has records of it, 23 other planetary systems. Different species, different biologies, different relationships between intelligent life and their ecosystems. Abena paused. All of them at approximately the same inflection point we were at when the ships arrived. All of them passed the threshold where self-correction was likely without intervention. And 19 of the 23 are what the database codes as. I'm translating. The word isn't exact, something like restored. The ecosystems are functioning. The species are present. There's evidence of ongoing relationship between the intelligent species and the ecological system. What happened to the other 4? A pause. The database doesn't say. The records just stop. The silence that followed had weight. 23 chances, Dara said finally. 19 recoveries. They've learned from the ones that didn't make it. They've refined the intervention. They've gotten better at calibrating it to the specific species and the specific damage and the specific knowledge level of the civilization. Abena looked at the yam, then at the threads running through the soil. What they gave us, the database, the seeds, the transition protocols, It's not what they gave the first civilization they tried to help. It's everything they've learned from every attempt, distilled into the most effective possible package for us. Dara thought about 12,000 years of watching, about the patience of something that had been observing the same story play out across 23 different worlds, and had accumulated, across all of those attempts, a deep and specific understanding of how to help a civilization in crisis find its way back. She thought about the weight of that patience, the grief of the four worlds where the records stopped, the determination to do better the next time, and the time after that, and to keep doing better until the method was as close to right as it could be. She thought about the cultivator crouching to meet her eye level, the warmth from its touch, the care in that act, which she had not understood at the time, and which she understood better now. They had been doing this long enough to know that hope was not naive. They had the receipts. 19 worlds that had made it through. They had come to Earth with everything they had learned from 22 previous attempts, and they had deployed it with the precision of something that genuinely, deeply, across distances and timescales that made human history look like a morning, cared about the outcome. She stood up. She looked at the food forest, the young trees, the vigorous ground cover, the dark, rich soil shot through with mycelium threads, the small leaves of the cassava that Menza had planted with his grandmother's song. And she felt something that she didn't have a word for. Not gratitude, because gratitude implied a transaction, and this was not clean. Not forgiveness, because she wasn't sure that was the right frame. Something more complicated. Something that had loss in it and anger and grief, and also, underneath all of it, like the dark soil underneath the surface of the forest, something that was alive and growing. Her mother's farm was gone. What was being built in its place was not her mother's farm, and would never be her mother's farm, and she needed to stop expecting it to be. But her mother's knowledge, the relationship between people and land that her family had practiced for 4 generations, the knowledge that had passed from grandmother to mother to the photograph in her pocket, that was not gone. That was in the soil, in the seeds, in the memory of Mensa's grandmother's song, in everything they were building. It had survived the thing that had tried to replace it. And it was, she understood now, exactly the kind of knowledge the cultivators had come to protect. They had not come to destroy what her mother had built. They had come to make room for what her mother had known. She walked toward the camp. She had a teaching session in 2 hours, and she knew now what she was going to say. She was going to tell them about her mother. Not as a story about loss, she had been telling it that way, in her head for 8 months, and she was tired of that story. As a story about knowledge, about 4 generations of attention to a specific piece of ground, about a woman who could stand in a field and read the condition of the soil from the color of the leaves and the behavior of the insects, and the particular way the air smelled before rain, who had learned this from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, who had carried it forward through every disruption and difficulty that had tried to interrupt it, because she understood that this knowledge was not separate from survival, but identical to it. That was the story she needed to tell. The morning light was warm and clear and full of ordinary birdsong. Wild birds, species that had come back in the months since the monoculture fields had dissolved and the ecological corridors had begun to reopen. She had not noticed the birds for months. She noticed them now. One of the green ships moved through the high clouds, its organic surface catching the light with a warmth she would have found unsettling 8 months ago and now found. She was honest with herself about this, almost familiar. The way you find familiar, the presence of something that has been near you long enough that you've stopped being afraid of it. She did not know what came next. She did not know how the full transition would unfold, how many years it would take, how many people would be lost before the food systems were stable enough to hold everyone, how the world would reorganize itself around the knowledge that industrial agriculture was gone and was not coming back. She knew there would be grief in it. She knew there would be loss she could not predict, and hardship she could not prepare for, and days when all of it would seem impossible. She also knew that there would be cassava leaves pushing through dark soil, and the sound of someone humming their grandmother's song, and a mycorrhizal network sharing what it had with everything around it, below the surface where no one could see. She had 14 rounds left once. Now she had something harder to carry and more worth carrying. She walked toward the sound of people waking, and breakfast being made from the first small harvests of the food forest, and the day beginning in the ordinary complicated way that days began when the world was trying, stubbornly and without asking permission, to become something better. She was ready. She found Colonel Mensa waiting for her at the edge of the teaching ground. A clearing they had made, between the food forest and the main camp, soft enough underfoot that people could sit without discomfort, ringed with the low native shrubs that Abena had identified as particularly effective nitrogen fixers. He had a radio in one hand, and an expression she had learned to read as the face he made when something large had happened, and he had decided to wait until he was certain before speaking. Report, she said. Nairobi, Johannesburg, Dakar. He listed the names with the careful precision of someone handling fragile objects. They've been watching what we're doing here. The transition protocols, Ando's team shared them through the network 6 weeks ago. He looked at her. They're working. All 3 sites confirm viable growth, soil improvement, yield projections above initial estimates. She took this in. That's not all, he continued. The network is larger than we knew. There are nodes we didn't have contact with in the first months. Communities that went silent during the initial chaos, but that were, it turns out, still there, still operating. Some of them have been growing food since the beginning, in the way that works, because they never stopped using the knowledge that the industrial age tried to replace. He paused. Hundreds of communities, across the continent, across the world. She had known intellectually that this was possible. She had believed it, in the abstract way that you believe things that you need to be true. But hearing the confirmation land in specific names, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Dakar, hundreds of communities, made it real in a way that abstractions did not. The human species was not feeding itself, not yet, not in the volumes that the old system had produced. But the human species was learning to feed itself again, in more places than anyone had known, using knowledge that had survived the industrial age and the margins and the memories and the communities that had chosen not to entirely forget. They were always there, she said. We just stopped looking. He folded the radio into his jacket. We stopped looking because we thought we didn't need them anymore, because the industrial system was producing so much, so reliably, that the old knowledge seemed redundant. Quaint. He paused. The cultivators knew that the knowledge was still there. That's in the database, too. They mapped it. The living repositories of traditional ecological knowledge. The communities that held it. They knew exactly where the knowledge survived before they acted. She thought about this. About an intervention designed not around what humanity had lost, but around what it had quietly kept. About 12,000 years of observation that it noticed, in the margins of the industrial age, the people who had not entirely abandoned the relationship that mattered. About the fact that the most important information for humanity's survival had not been in the hands of the military or the scientists or the governments. It had been in the memory of elder farmers and the practice of rural communities, and the knowledge that grandmothers passed to grandchildren in gardens and fields that the modern world considered unimportant. It had been there all along. We're going to be all right, she said. The colonel looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has just been offered permission to put it down. Yes, he said, I think we are. She walked to the teaching ground. Her group was gathering 20 people, ranging in age from Mensa's 15 to an elderly woman named Madame Achimpong, who had arrived 2 weeks ago from a village outside Kumasizi and who turned out to have embedded in her specific memory of the land and the seasons and the ways of the plants more directly useful knowledge than anyone else in the compound. Dara had quietly stopped teaching the sessions that Madame Achiampong attended and started treating them as learning sessions for everyone else, with Madame Achiampong as the actual teacher and herself as the person who made sure everyone understood the question to ask. Madame Achiampong was already sitting in the clearing when Dara arrived, shelling something into a bowl with the automatic ease of someone doing something they have done every day of their life. She had a faint, private smile as she worked, the smile of someone who finds the situation ironic, but has decided that irony is not the most useful response. Sergeant, she said without looking up. Madame Achimpong, today you were going to tell them about your mother. Dara sat down across from her. How did you know that? Because you've been about to say something true for several weeks, and today you have the face of someone who has decided to say it. She paused her shelling. Your mother's name? Adwoa. And what did Adwoa know that you want them to know? Dara thought about how to answer this. The group was settling around them, finding seats, the conversation and movement quieting to the particular attentive stillness that meant people were ready to listen. She knew that the soil was alive, she said finally, not metaphorically, literally alive. She used to take a handful of the farm soil and hold it up and tell me there were more living organisms in that handful than there were humans on Earth, and she treated it accordingly, not as a medium for growing things, but as something that needed to be kept healthy, because everything she grew was a relationship with that living thing. She paused. She said the farm's job was to make the soil richer than it found it, not just to take, to give back more than it took, and did it, Madame Achiampong asked, for 4 generations, a breath, until the compound, a silence in the group, not uncomfortable. The silence of people sitting with something. Then the farm did its job, Madame Achiampong said simply. 4 generations is not the end. It's a foundation, she resumed her shelling. You build on foundations, that's what they're for. Dara looked at the food forest beyond the clearing. She looked at the faces of the 20 people sitting in the morning light, most of them holding the particular attentiveness of people who understand that what they are about to learn is not optional. She looked at the sky. Then she began to talk about her mother. She talked about Edwoa Okafor and the 100 hectares outside Kumasi, and 4 generations of relationship with a specific piece of ground. She talked about the soil and the seasons and the knowledge that had passed between women in her family, like a language, particular and alive and not written down anywhere because it did not need to be written down, because it lived in the hands and the eyes and the specific attentiveness of people who knew that the land was speaking and had learned to listen. She talked about loss. She did not pretend the loss was not loss. She talked about what survived loss. She talked about a young soldier planting cassava with his grandmother's song. She talked about a mycorrhizal network in the dark soil, sharing below the surface. She talked about a root placed in her hand by something that had traveled incomprehensible distances and waited 12,000 years because it believed, with a confidence she was beginning to understand, that the species it was trying to help was worth the effort. She talked for a long time, and then Madame Achiampong, who had been listening with her hands still and her eyes closed, opened her eyes and picked up a handful of soil from the clearing floor and held it out in the flat of her palm and said, "Who can tell me what they see?" And the learning began the way learning begins when it is real, not with answers, but with attention, and not with certainty, but with the willingness to be taught by something older and larger and more patient than yourself. Above the clearing, in the high blue of the morning sky, one of the green ships caught the light. It held it for a moment, warm and certain. Then it moved on.